Well, I suppose this is sufficiently climactic, isn't it? Now it's time for the plan to go into full effect. We've got the captured bugs strapped with as many explosives as it can carry. And with the Sathe Fancy's most amazing mental powers, we're going to drive that sucker straight down into the center of the underground hive. And then boom, no more bugs. You get the personal honor of directing the ugly thing. Go talk to Narayan. Yeah, that's happening. Anyway, question number 1 is from Calliope Rannis. With the recent surge in multiplayer content you've been doing and the diverse amount of people that you've been doing it with, it reminds me of an old thing you said where you prefer stuff like Game Grumps content and actually watching, when actually watching LPs, as opposed to solo content where the vast majority, like the vast majority of yours was back then. Now that the balance and regularity of the multiplayer social content has significantly changed, do you feel like your own channel is closer to what you prefer watching on YouTube than it was before? Technically, kind of, I guess. Sorry, where's this Nair person? There you are. Like, where's the person I need to click on? For this Sathe Fancy power. Oh my god. Okay, this will be a quest. So to catch people up on the previous discourse up to this point on this subject of what I'm talking about here, sniffer pheromones. Oof. Am I doing it? Probably not. Oh well. As far as the previous discussion of this, it's just that I started doing Let's Plays with Andrew as a two-person thing, and that was closer to what I originally liked, is like people just hanging out, joking around, sitting on a couch, more or less. That kind of experience while playing said game. And generally speaking, the content I make on this channel that took off is not the type of content that I watch on YouTube. A few things have changed, but we'll catch up with that. But basically I would do the me and Andrew hanging out, joking around, like personality driven content, and it just never, our original channel just never really did very well. But I think, as I said before in a video in this series, when Andrew was moving and stuff, I still wanted to keep doing this, maybe just because of sunk cost fallacy or something, but I just didn't want to stop what I'd already been doing for like 2 years at that point. And so I started my personal channel, or more specifically, I took my personal channel that I've had since 2006 and started uploading my own Let's Plays on it, starting with Outlast and Demon's Souls, and then Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2, and that's sort of where the trajectory took me. But I would never really watch, I pretty much never watch the kind of content that I create. Not only do I not really watch my own videos, I don't really watch videos like my videos. I don't watch videos where one person plays through a game methodically and whatnot, or like, I don't watch videos where the purpose is to some extent vicariously experience the game itself. Instead, I pretty much have exclusively watched Let's Play channels where the point is more or less to just be with those people, and you're basically just along for the ride for whatever they happen to cover. Which some people do with my stuff now too, but it's always been like that, and it was always multiple people things. And the mainstay for the longest time has been Game Grumps, although I'm becoming incredibly aware of the fact that I basically haven't watched their content with any regularity for the last like 6 months or so. I pretty much just watched the Power Hour video they'd make every week, which I really do enjoy. But I do find myself constantly falling behind on their actual Let's Plays, and in fact, I find myself not watching Let's Plays in general. So while the original argument... So there's a few reasons, there's a few like clarifications to make about this general point, and one of them is the fact that actually nowadays I've drifted away from the idea of even watching Let's Plays at all. I watch large amounts of YouTube content, but at this point, what happened is it used to be that video essays and like compelling, thought-provoking, interesting things that I find and whatnot would be like an irregularity and a rarity. Like I'd find some channels and they'd upload like once a month or maybe even less than that. Some of them even wouldn't show up for months, and they'd be like my favorite content, but they'd be so spread out that I kind of was filling the in-between time with podcasts and Let's Plays. And I keep finding more channels that make really cool stuff all the time, which, if you don't know, I have a recommended videos playlist on my profile, like front page, that you can look at, or you can search it up on my profile or something, maybe, because I do try to share this stuff. I try to filter out the more political aspects and mostly put the more neutral videos in that playlist, so it's somewhat filtered in that way, I guess. But it's a lot of the channels show up in there that I'm talking about. And at this point, I have so many cool videos that I like on a regular basis coming out, and then that crossed with the fact that Netflix in particular just keeps putting things in front of me that I can watch, either Netflix originals or just like various other shows that I find compelling that keep showing up regularly on there. That like I straight up, like, between watching like 3 or 4 video essays per day and then like catching up on stuff like the Umbrella Academy or the 100 or something, like I actually don't really have more time for consuming video content, and I even have a backlog of movies that I'm trying to get to. So it's not a great time for watching Let's Plays anymore. I'm soliciting people to sign a charter. Oh, this is a thing. Okay. So the real answer is, nowadays I don't really watch Let's Plays almost at all. Like, one of the other mainstays was that I would watch the Achievement Hunter Minecraft series, and I've been adding those to my watch later list for a distressingly long time, to the point where now when I look back at the backlog of what I've added to the watch later list, I'm like, am I ever actually going to get caught up on this series? Because I'm probably, like, I think I went on a trip to the beach like last May or something, and since then I've had a playlist that I made just for the backlog of videos that I fell behind on during that trip that has been inflating since then, all the way around to now, where it's almost a year later and I'm still adding videos to it and not chipping away at it as fast as I could add videos to it. And then, like, just generally my ability to consume content I want to consume on YouTube is becoming like untenable to some extent. And in particular, I've completely fallen off like all of my podcasts, which bothers me, because there's a lot of podcasts I like, but I don't keep up with them anymore. And I'm completely out of. I tried converting a bunch of them, because like I kind of hit my peak of listening to podcasts as a combination of going to college and just having my commute. I used to drive 2 hours per day. I would drive an hour to my college from home and then drive an hour back. Sometimes drive 2 hours back because the traffic could get really bad, especially if there was some kind of accident, while also listening to podcasts between classes. Like, sometimes between classes I'd be meeting up with certain people I knew, and we'd hang out between certain periods. But there's also parts of college where I was just kind of on my own for big chunks of time, for hours maybe. And since I was going to college in a different city, nowhere near home, that meant that, like, between classes I needed to consume, like, I needed to entertain myself, which generally meant consuming internet content, which would either be, if I had a laptop on hand, I would watch YouTube videos. But if I wasn't lugging around a laptop, because a laptop was more of a computer science thing than a geology thing, it just wasn't as necessary to carry something that heavy around all the time, there was a decent chance that I would just fire up my iPod Touch, which I had. It was my iPod Touch 3, which had all my podcasts on it, and I would just walk around in circles kind of for hours just across the campus. The campus was like multiple square miles of campus, so you could just walk in the crowds without any particular aim for huge spans of time, without it being in any way weird. I could pretty much like sit down for lunch, like go order my lunch, sit down and eat that while listening to podcasts, and then just kind of at some point just kind of wander around listening to podcasts. So obviously I got a lot of that done. And then I had my cubicle job where I just sat in a cubicle and maintained spreadsheets, basically. And it was very kind of mind-numbing and busy worky. And I kind of needed some distractions to keep me sane, because otherwise I would just be... my life would just be these spreadsheets 8 hours a day, and that would be brutal. So for a lot of that time I was listening to podcasts, especially since I think they were monitoring my computer. I think they were monitoring everyone's computers, so I don't think that it was safe to, like, slack off or be distracted by things on the computer itself. So all of my distractions or whatever had to come from my phone or my podcast device, which was not my phone. Until very recently, I've never actually used my smartphone for podcasts. I've always had a second device, in part because it would be a device that I could leave in my car plugged into the radio. I specifically had a cable that was under the seat of my car, because it was like retrofit. I had a Firebird that was retrofitted to have a plug in a really awkward place for the MP3 player. And like I could just let it sit, and it would auto resume from where it left off whenever I turned the car on and stuff like that. And I didn't want to leave my phone in those kinds of situations necessarily, but also because my phones, generally speaking, no phone I've ever had actually had the storage space that my iPods had. Like, it got really easy to get iPods that had hundreds of gigs of space. But you get phones and they have garbage amounts of space unless you manually upgrade them with expensive chips and stuff that don't come with them, or whatever the hell. It was just a weird thing that I noticed, is like these things that are only meant for MP3s had ungodly amounts of storage space. And it might be because MP3s don't require that much of a draw speed, so maybe, or a read speed, so maybe it has something to do with the idea that, like, phones might have higher demands on their storage space, so maybe they have to be faster, and that might be why they're smaller, or it might just because people are being dicks. Because I can't help but think back to when the Xbox 360 had the Pro version had 20 whole gigs of space, and the arcade version had 256 megabytes or 512 megabytes. It had not even 1 gig. They shipped a multiple $100 console that had not even 1 gig of storage space in 2005 or 6. What the fuck, dude? That was messed up. That was just weird. But I always had them on the separate space, and like, so I had all this time. Like, I would listen to podcasts for my entire shift when I was working at the water board, because I was just in a cubicle managing spreadsheets completely in my lonesome. There was no collaboration aspect of my job. I was just on my own. It's why I liked it's why I really liked it whenever I got a day out where we were gonna go out and collect samples, because that'd be a whole day of like road trip with one other person, hanging out in the car and talking while we mostly are just driving all day from point to point, and then when we get there we just take our samples and we quiet down and get our stuff done, and then we get right back in the car and go back to talking for the next half an hour. Those were a nice break from the cubicle days where I was just slowly going insane in a gray box. Yay. But I just burned through podcasts just all day. Like, that was back when I even had the appetite for the crazy podcasts. Like, during that period, I was listening to the Giant Bombcast, which I had been listening to before, because I also used to work at my dad's shop and would also listen to podcasts the whole time I was there, too, because it was also me kind of just working on my own all day, but in a much less insane kind of way, because it was actually, it was a kind of busy work that was way more entertaining. Working with upholstery is way more entertaining than working with spreadsheets. Like, it's such an example where, like, the blue-collar example is so much nicer than the supposed, like, white-collar style job of sitting at a computer. Because managing a spreadsheet all day is way worse than, like, you know, measure twice, cut once, and, like, marking out all these patterns and sewing fabric and doing all this other stuff is, like, way more engaging. And you're also using your hands in a variety of ways, while still not being like any kind of like dangerous, intensive physical labor. That kind of like arts and crafts style job is so much more engaging and hands-on than being the grunt that has to do spreadsheets for years. between that job and that other job and that college issue situation, I just so many podcasts, just hundreds and hundreds, thousands of hours of podcasts. The point where, yeah, I would actually listen to something like Giant Bomb, which is like a 3-hour podcast every week, and then they had a secondary podcast called the Giant Beast Cast because they split locations across the country into 2 campuses or 2 offices, and so they had 2 super long podcasts, and I was listening to both of them in addition to several other things, like so many podcasts. And so back then I also would, of course, would have more time for like Let's Plays and all these other things. But yeah, nowadays I generally have less time for consuming that kind of content, while also having more content that's edging out that kind of stuff more and more, has been my experience. In part because I can't listen to podcasts while I work in this job. Mostly. Like when I'm doing the part you're listening to right now, or the Let's Play, or the full-on Let's Play equivalent, although the functional difference isn't that big, I can't listen to podcasts during that. Not only would I just be way worse, if I was some kind of superhuman that could listen to somebody else talk while also doing this whole show, I would probably actually belong in a lab. But also, like, the content would probably be worse even if I could pull that off, just because I'd be distracted. But like, yeah, you can't really multitask because the act of commentating and Let's Playing is itself already a form of multitasking. The ogre must be weakened first? I don't know if I understand this one. There you go. Let's see if I can figure this one out. Oh, there you go. Yeah, just beat him up and feed him. It's like Pokemon, except instead of catching the Pokemon, you're like, you're always like this when you're hungry. Here's a Snickers. That's the quest. But yeah, I have less, weirdly, despite the fact that like this is like a weird self-driven job where I kind of make my own hours and everything, I actually have way less free time for that kind of content than ever before, because as it turns out, that kind of content was something that I was largely consuming while doing my job and other things I had to do, as opposed to now where that's the work I do can't really multitask. I can't multitask when I'm recording. There's very few gaming related chances to multitask. It mostly comes down to like when I have to replay a chunk of a game to get back to where I was, like if I die in an awkward place in like a Dark Souls style game and I don't want to do an entire episode of me fighting my way back to that spot for 20 minutes, then I have to do it off camera, or if I have to grind, or if I have to do mostly grinding, then that's the kind of thing where suddenly I can pop up a second thing and be making headway on my backlog of stuff while I'm also doing the gaming. But generally speaking, the gaming content has no overlap with multitasking like it used to. Which I've said before, I do think is a good thing, because I've talked before about how there's a whole era of gaming where I did stuff like play Nier the first time, and allow and as if you watch me play Nier, you will probably know that I went into it knowing that I'd played it before, but also largely didn't actually know what was I didn't remember like half the story because of the fact that I'd been multitasking the first time I played it, and it kind of shows how harmful multitasking can be to your ability to experience or even judge a game and remember it and so on. It also kind of speaks to why maybe some certain genres can remain popular despite being so unengaging, like those, like we talked about in the previous Anthem episode, is because a lot of that stuff probably pairs well with multitasking. If you play the same competitive game constantly so that it becomes second nature, or you play grinding games where that demand very little of you moment to moment, then you can probably get away with not really fully paying attention, but it gives you the ability to multitask, and for some people that's valid. And then some people, that's what they want to do, is they want to be simultaneously consuming all the things that they're not getting to consume while they're at their job, for example. Specifically, my brother's fiance, and my brother actually, when I go downstairs in this house, I see them, and my brother's usually playing Diablo 2 or League of Legends, and his fiance is pretty much always playing League of Legends, and they have two monitors, and their second monitor is always like a show, or it's a or it's like or like they're one of them scrolling down Tumblr, like every time they queue or something like that, they're scrolling down and they spend the queue time scrolling through the other thing. Like they have like, it's a lot of people play games while also multitasking another thing that's a secondary form of entertainment. And so if you take that for granted, then I can see why a lot of people would play much less intensive games that don't demand much of them, in part because they're just trying to cool down from work and don't want actually to be demanded of, but also because they want to simultaneously consume a secondary form of content at the same time, which I caution against. If it's something that you don't value that much, then it's fine, I guess. Like if you're playing, like, I'm playing Warframe while listening to the Philip DeFranco show or something. Like, something where you're not necessarily gonna... a game that doesn't require that much of your brain while also consuming a piece of content that you're not necessarily physically watching, then I guess you can do that. But, there's a lot of content that only really works if you are giving it your full attention, and if you're not careful, you can turn the combined experience into just kind of a vague gray mush where you're not really getting anything out of either of the things you're consuming, and that's just kind of a bummer. And it's hard to, and because the brain's so flawed, you often can't tell while it's happening that that's what you're doing. My example I think I gave before was the idea that, like, my friend Max would like be like, oh yeah, let's go watch Heroes, and because I had the DVDs of Heroes, and we were watching through the series, and I would just look over and he would just be on his phone texting or something the entire episode, despite being the one who supposedly wanted to watch the show. And if you asked him, he would be sure that he totally understood everything that was happening in the show. But if you actually asked him anything about, like, trivia questions, he would be completely lost on the most basic plot elements because he wasn't actually paying attention. But he was confident that he was, because our brains can't really tell when we're not fully engaging. Well, sometimes you can, like when you fall asleep during a lecture in class or something, but there's more subtler forms of not absorbing information that are much harder to keep track of. And I'm hyper aware of this stuff because I constantly deal with the idea of whether or not you absorb information and stuff like that, because I publicly engage in this form of trying to absorb information and failing to do so in front of an audience constantly every day, and they're happy to point it out every time I don't notice something, or I forget something a moment after saying it out loud and stuff like that, which is just I've long since come to terms with the fact that, like, it's not my fault and not a thing that's like a flaw in me. It's just the general issue of how humans work being put on display for everyone, and a large audience of people that can't engage with the idea that they would be just as flawed if they were forced into the same situation, which they largely can't be, because you can't really just tell someone, well, you just go make your own YouTube channel and, you know, magically get an audience overnight so that you can live your version of this experience and know what it's like. Like, there's no real way to show people that kind of experience, so you just kind of have to take it for, you kind of just have to, like, take my word for the idea of it, which is not really that doable. But that's the idea. And boy, did I go on tangents in this one. It's fine. I know I'm well aware that I barely have any questions, so it's fine. I can go as far as I want. And this is self-damaging, of course. Me warning people away from multitasking when, of course, the thing that I do is a thing that people often consume while multitasking. Sometimes while even playing the same game, which in some of these cases sounds hard to do. Although if you're some of these people, then I can see some of it. Like if you're somebody that's on your 7th playthrough of Resident Evil 2 because you're trying to get that double triple S rank mega run on hardcore, then I guess at that point you're probably multitasking a bit. But if you're having your, like, authentic first experience with a lot of games, then, like, I don't think that that's the way to do it. and so on. I'm speaking from my own mistakes because of how there's an era. There was a whole era, the Xbox 360 era, where largely I was not only achievement hunting, but I was achievement hunting like that was the primary reason to play video games. I was just going into games for the purpose of getting their achievements, and I was multitasking with other content like podcasts and YouTube to sort of distract me while I was achievement hunting. While in many cases these were games that I had not played before once in a non-distracted form, and my ability to remember said games in a lot of ways has been compromised and so on. And it speaks something a bit to the power of BioWare, that I specifically was not doing that during any BioWare game ever, because I needed to absorb all the BioWare, and I even knew that back then, because I really liked the Mass Effect and Dragon Age games. But that speaks to my general situation as far as content consumption goes, and I think you yourself, the person asking this question, has seen me link and chat before my various giant watch later playlists, of which there are multiple, because like I keep running into a trap where I come up with a more immediate one, where like there's the watch later playlist, which is built into YouTube. Everyone has a watch later playlist even if they don't have any videos in it, which in videos get automatically added to that if you click the little stopwatch icon in the corner of the thumbnail, and it's a nice playlist. It's useful if you can maintain it. But then I made another playlist called the Watch Next playlist, which was supposed to be a more immediate one, a stopgap for when I like I hit a point where I was having trouble keeping up with content in a more immediate sense, and also I wanted to prioritize one over the other. Like I wanted to put more spoilery content that I was specifically avoiding in the Watch Later playlist, and putting stuff that I can watch more immediately and more passively in the Watch Next playlist. So like stuff that was like about a movie I wanted to watch but hadn't watched yet would go in the Watch Later playlist, but like stuff that I wanted to consume now-ish was in the Watch Next playlist, and but then that inflated to hundreds of videos, and now I've got the podcast backlog playlist, which was supposed to just be some podcasts that I fell behind on at one point, and also like the entirety of some new podcast that I found out about that I wanted to go to, so I added their entire backlog to that playlist, and the idea was that I would listen to it in chronological order by release date. That's where stuff like the Please Stop Talking podcast went in its entirety, in addition to like random podcasts that I was just falling behind on at the time. But now that video is hundreds of playlists long, and because I was falling behind on other things, I started adding stuff that wasn't podcasts to that. So like various like lower priority video essay channels were getting put into there, or various other things I just wasn't keeping up with that I could watch passively in a kind of podcast sort of way, like listen to, are all going in there. But now it's also hundreds of videos long, and I'm like, there's so much content on YouTube, and even the stuff that even when you try to filter it, you can't keep up with it. So the idea of even watching my like daily 10-20 minutes of Game Grumps has actually largely fallen by the wayside in favor of a bunch of other things and so on. So that's the whole thing. But as far as the original idea, I would still say that what's going on now is not the same thing as what I was talking about when I talked about preferring a certain type of content. Because multiplayer competitive content is also not a thing that I watch. Specifically, like, in the Game Grumps can actually be used as an example here. Game Grumps will randomly, or at least has in the past, in their Grumpcade show that's now defunct, would be like, hey, we're playing Overwatch now, and they'd put up this big Overwatch video of a bunch of people playing Overwatch, and it's not the same thing. I can see why the distinction could be confusing because it is multiple people as opposed to one person, but the commentary is another completely different category. A solo person doing a walkthrough is one thing. A solo person doing a blind let's play is a whole other thing. And then multiplayer competitive commentary is a whole other thing. And then yet again, 2 or 3 people sitting on a couch together, experiencing a game together, which might be single player, is a completely different category in its own. So like, while this is multiplayer, this is largely not quite the type of content that I'm talking about. In particular, especially with stuff like Apex and Overwatch, there's generally just less room for like color commentary and conversation and jokes, as opposed to a lot of it just being tactical commentary of a game you're trying to win and calling shots and communication and so on, and talking about the mechanics of the game. In a weird way, competitive gameplay is where things kind of, the commentary kind of loops back around in a multiplayer setting, away from how multiplayer commentary naturally goes, because I think multiplayer stuff often is naturally off topic and meandering and all over the place and wacky, but it kind of loops back around to being more like that single player blind playthrough commentary the moment you're playing with a group of people that's trying to work together to win a game. And there's value in that, and but it is very much a different category in its own. Whereas when I talk about the kind of content that I want, that I wanted to be doing in the first place, and that I would watch myself, we're talking stuff like when Andrew and I play a Sonic game, or when we play Alone in the Dark, or when we play the Zero Escape and 999 games. Like, that kind of stuff is what I want. So if anything, the closest I get to that right now, aside from the actual Andrew videos that happen every now and then, is basically my weekly recording session with Bird, where we like right now we're playing Dawn of War, and we're like, that kind of commentary is closer, at least. Although Dawn of War is a little intensive, so we could get focus on that at times, like with more mechanical conversation. But really, I think the biggest thing is just that in order to fully acquire what I want it to be like, I'd basically have to be in the same room as Bird, because there is a very noticeable difference. Like, something that I would point out is, like, I have done like probably like 100 podcasts on this channel or something like that, and if you look at the various podcasts I've done, and you can contrast the ones that I did via voice chat on like TeamSpeak or whatever, with all the face cams and the webcams and shit, the tone, the pacing and everything of that, contrast that with what it's like when Andrew and I are sitting in a room face to face during the Sit and Discuss podcast, and you'll see that there's a stark difference that can't really be recaptured, and that's just part of the experience. There's it's just when people are actually there in the room, the energy is different, and it changes the commentary in a number of ways. In part, there's the fact that you, when you're playing it on the computer, you're balancing the audio of the other people versus the audio of the game, while being very aware of the fact that you're sitting alone in a room with no other people there, and they only exist as this voice floating over your game. And whatever thing you're talking over has some kind of latency to it that disrupts the natural flow of conversations, but also the natural energy of it all. And then compare to that to like how commentary works when you're playing a let's play of a game with somebody in the same room. Like, generally speaking, how it usually worked is that any audio that was happening was coming out of the TV, which was set to a low volume, while you're sitting on a couch with 2 to 3 or 4 other people, and you're all physically present. Like, you can look at each other, you can share, like, you can share a look or read expressions, and also like the voices are physically in the room with you and everything. And also the game and the TV all take like a back seat to your direct interactions and so on. Like, the tone is very different, and it's almost impossible to recapture in an online setting. And I know, because I've been trying to for like the last 6 years, because I'm constantly doing this stuff online, only because that's the only way to do it with these people and so on in general. And nowadays, that's the only way to do it with Andrew, because in particular, Andrew no longer has his previous property. He's living with family now, and I'm living in and I've also moved again, and I'm even further away from there in the meantime, because we both moved. He moved, then I moved, then he moved back, but not quite. And so not only is the commute even longer now, I believe, if I want to do anything with Andrew, but also we don't have the space that we used to have. In fact, he doesn't even have a computer. At this point he just has a laptop. So that room where Sit and Discuss was recorded, and all the hardware that was used to record it with, and so on, like all that stuff with all that setup we had for Zero Escape and 999, and for the Sit and Discuss podcast, that entire setup is unobtainable at the moment, and that's not likely to change. And so that nowadays, like, yeah, like if I want to record something with Andrew, we do it the way that I do the Shibuya Scramble series, which is I'm doing it online with him now, just like I did with everybody else, even though he's somebody that's actually local-ish. And it is kind of a bummer that, yeah, even if he does agree to do Zero Time Dilemma ever, it'll probably be in that form. So even then, the energy will be a bit different, because we'll be doing it online as opposed to in the same room, because just life changes happened in the meantime. And there's no real easy answer, because a lot of the stuff can only be changed by money, basically. Like, I think I've actually had this talk with him before, even, where, like, I'm pretty sure Andrew would just, like, get hired by me if I could hire him, but I can't even afford an office space of my own, let alone hire somebody else to work there too. But like, basically, yeah, just sheer amounts of money is like the only real way to fix the several social boundaries, because I live firmly in the form where I can just barely support what I do just for myself. So any collaborative stuff is just totally just whatever happens. It's like, if you ever wonder like why I'm not freaking out that like there's a dog barking or a cat meowing in the background of other people's microphones that I play with sometimes, or like the fact that like I play with people that I can't necessarily guarantee will show up for the next session, and like maybe any given multiplayer series might die at any given moment and stuff like that. Like, it's because that's just the reality. Like, I can't force other people to have the commitment that I do, because it's literally my job and it's not anybody else's at all. Bird's been dedicated to it for a very long time, since he had his channel in like 2013 and stuff, and he's been sticking with it despite the fact that he has jobs to keep him busy and everything. But it's really everyone's individual choice to stick with the stuff or not stick with it. And so that's why it's a whole thing. Like when it comes to like Lovers in a Dangerous Space-Time, which hasn't had episodes for months or something, like on top of the actual difficulties of coordinating with a bunch of people to all want to go to a specific place on a specific day to record, and then also commuting all the way out to that location, I also have to deal with just like, are they actually interested in doing that? Like, does anyone want to spend time on that kind of thing, or do they want to just talk about the next opportunity to do they instead just want to talk about the next opportunity to play Twilight Imperium or do a tabletop night or an escape room or something? And those are all like different things that weigh against each other for their free time, and that's in the limited free time of people who are figuring out what to do with their free time between their shifts at their job. That's a whole thing. But yeah, I would largely say that the content I make both isn't and largely can't be what I was talking about when I say the kind of content that I originally tried to make, and the content that I would actually watch, generally speaking. That's the general thing. And if you want a gist of that, if you want a primer on me and Andrew's old content, because you didn't watch it, because most of you haven't, because most of you weren't around, not like age-wise, but like viewership-wise, like we didn't have a following, so it's very statistically unlikely that any of you were there at the time, and very few of you will have gone back to look, because people don't tend to go back in general. or follow links or anything. But one primer is that there was the Andrews leaving video. I don't remember what it's called anymore, but it was the one that had like the anywhere but here thumbnail, where Andrew's getting ready to leave to Dubai. Like that video, if you watch that, we recap a lot of the old stuff. And also we sit there and we actually watch our own videos and kind of live react to them and stuff like that, which is kind of a fun thing we did. But also what you can do is you can actually just go to the sad games and type the word highlights into the search bar in the channel. And you'll get the highlight videos I used to make. And you can kind of get a short fire version of like the general tone and energy level and stuff like that of that stuff. And you'll probably be shocked by a lot of that and just how massively different a lot of it is to what I do. I'm not you know, on some level it's partly that I'm not somebody that can just like manufacture weird amounts of hype and energy. So like a lot of the crazy stuff is often kind of exclusive to multiplayer contexts where I've got people to bounce off of and to build off of, and that's where the energy goes up and everything. Whereas the stuff I make naturally when I'm on my own is pretty chill, and naturally is the only way that I really make content. I can't make myself start every video by screaming a catchphrase the way many people do, and then just maintain that high level yelling the entire video. So like but when I'm building up the energy of people in the same room, while it doesn't ever reach like that level, it definitely is a difference from what people are probably largely familiar with. That's probably it for the that's probably it for the question. That's probably way more of an answer than necessary, but covered a lot of the bases and I think covered all the aspects. Yeah, it's a general update on me consuming media and my general reaction to that original conversation, because it's drifted. It's not only have the definitions drifted, but like the goalposts of what's being compared to what have drifted, in that my very media consumption keeps drifting and so on. So nothing's the same. It's the hero's journey. You leave and you come back, and you come back changed, and it's like you can't even be a part of the society you were trying to get back to anymore anyway. It's like the ending of the Lord of the Rings. What am I talking about? I'm gonna mess this one up. Sathe asks, if you had to choose one religion to follow out of all that have ever existed, which would you choose? Oh boy. Alright, so as background, I am somebody who is completely unreligious. There was some period when I was a teenager where I would save something vague about like believing in karma or something, which I think was just me trying to come up with an answer to please people. There's a certain aspect of when you're a kid or a teenager and adults ask questions and then you answer a certain way and then they get like a shocked expression on your face. Then you end up trying to change your answer to please them, kind of, or like you kind of just keep coming up with new answers until you seem to have done it right, which on some level is how you're kind of raised as a kid, is like, especially with the school system and everything. There's an aspect of like kind of guessing your way and manipulating around until you get the right answer to some extent. This is actually kind of a fucked up point in the Making a Murderer documentary series. Is this idea that like the basis of the defense of one of the people in that series is the idea that like, are they somebody of a lower IQ that was manipulated into giving a false confession for a murder that they didn't commit because they were just with authority figures that kept pressuring them to give a better answer until they finally just basically walked into a false confession. That whole idea. Fun. And so like that, so like I at some point would come up with bullshit like that. I specifically remember being in 8th grade, and it was 8th grade with my English teacher, and so religion came up in some way, and I said that I was atheist, and she seemed like taken aback, or like, and she kind of like asked questions and kind of seemed to come to some conclusion that I'm not actually atheist, I'm agnostic. And I just kind of accepted that at the time because I didn't necessarily know the distinction at the time. And honestly, to this day, don't necessarily care because if we're going to speak honestly, religion just plays no role in my life except for how other people behave. Which is to say that it only affects me in that it affects other people, and those people affect me. I think I've been to 2 church ceremonies while I was growing up that weren't like a wedding or a funeral or anything, and I don't remember how I got there, but it was probably one of my grandfathers who is very religious, and probably the only aspect of religion in my life ever. He would I think he just took us to one at some point, and I just kind of sat there bored, not understanding what was happening or why I was there. It's a strange thing to just find yourself in without any pretense. Generally speaking, religious conversations have not gone over well because it basically comes with them making some kind of religious argument unprovoked, and then I just take the things that they said literally and ask basic questions about the thing they just proposed to me, and then they get kind of like flustered, and then the conversation kind of shuts down almost immediately because I don't know. On some level, I think it's that people who are particularly religious, because they are often raised in it and in completely ensconced in it and surrounded by it, immersed in it, and everyone around them agrees upon the stuff, that sometimes even the most basic questions about a thing will have been something you've never thought about before, because nobody around you is necessarily asking questions. And I can't speak to everyone's situation, that's just been my observation of the people around me, and when it comes to these kinds of these topics, is that it can often be literally the first question I have when they presented me something is something that they get flustered about, and then the thing ends. And I'm not even being like aggressive. I don't know. Because I totally could be a dick about the whole thing, but I don't want to deal with the fallout of that ever. But every time I say anything, I end up being a dick on accident, it seems. And it's just been a whole experience. I think they've largely given up at this point. Although I have very, like, as far as you want to talk about religious people, it's like, it goes from 0 to off the deep end immediately, like, trying to, and this speaks to some of my anger about homeopathy and stuff like that, is that I have people that, my direct household was non-religious, and I've never had any exposure to religion from either my parents, both of which aren't, but like I have extended family that like tries to like use like natural foods and praying to like beat cancer and stuff like that, as opposed to like, you know, medicine, and like they have like homeopathy like cabins and shit, and I'm like, yeah, it turns out I might have an axe to grind about some of these things. Like and when I brought up on the podcast, someone was mad at me for like daring to speak against homeopathy, and I'm like, but it's like, no, like the people who believe in homeopathy are not in any significant way different from people that are like anti-vaxxers. Like they're people who just decided to make up their own medicine and not care when the results are clearly not there. And there's somebody just letting their own feelings make up what the rules are, and it doesn't matter that it clearly doesn't work. And I just, oh boy, it's a whole thing. Wow, a multi-target fight. I haven't done this for a bit. There we go. What was the question that happened? I'm probably gonna miscite this entire idea, because I'm not immersed in the culture and everything, and will misremember the stuff more often than not. But I think it was more like the idea of like the topic was like what happened to all the people before Jesus showed up. It was like the idea like Jesus made everyone aware of what you're supposed to do and not do to get into heaven, was like this idea, like what sin is and what sin isn't, and how, you know, the religion. And it's like, well, what happened to everybody who was born and died or never became aware of Christianity before that point? Like, were they just all doomed inherently? And then I think they claimed some strange idea that like everybody before that point essentially got a pass due to like their ignorance. Like this idea that like because they had not been saved yet, it's like they were somehow exempt from this rule set in some way. But then I asked what I thought was a really obvious follow-up question of like, well, then doesn't that mean that Jesus doomed everybody instead of saving them? Because if everybody before Jesus was safe because they didn't know better, then it wasn't Jesus telling everybody like the actual rules and showing up instead of being the salvation moment? Wasn't that actually dooming everybody? Because suddenly now a huge percentage of people are constantly on that risk of going to hell for how they behave, because it's the post-Jesus world, where before that was apparently a time when that wasn't a problem. And like that kind of turns the entirety of Jesus's concept on its head if he actually doomed everyone instead of saving them. And like it actually turns Jesus into a secondary version of the apple of Eden, from like Jesus is a second version of this tree of knowledge that dooms everybody, where everyone was previously in God's garden, aka being in the version of the world where you don't go to hell. And then Jesus shows up with his apple, which is his existence, and essentially dooms people to not be safe anymore unless they do really specific things and live their life in a really specific way in order to prove themselves or something. And no, I did not go on this giant tirade. It was just the one, I just asked the one question. But this is me expanding on the idea, and that I'm thinking about, I'm like, oh wow, that's like, that conclusion would lead to them being the apple of Eden or something. And I just asked the question, and I wasn't like aggressive or anything about it, or like, oh yeah, I owned the religious people with facts and logic. It's just like they started a conversation, and I was being conversational, and they were it went bad. They didn't like yell at, I never get yelled at in these situations. It's always just like they get kind of flustered, and it just kind of, the conversation stops. And I think that was the one where they never talked to me again about religion. I think that was the final time. And then I have been spared since. So I guess it worked out for me. Because I don't really want to talk about this stuff. But they bring it to me because in part, one of the awkward things was that they had a daughter, which is technically my half aunt, I guess. But she's significantly younger than me because she was born much later in life. And she would, as many religious children do, would look at other people from other families and think that they're in danger and like doomed, and you have to save them because you're being programmed to have all these systems of guilt and fear from an early age. And if you see other people you care about that aren't following the rules of what you're supposed to do to be saved, then you think that you like, oh no, I have to help them, which is nice. It's adorable. It's really nice of the kid to be so concerned. Like it's really pure, but misguided and a mess. It actually kind of speaks to the. It actually maybe speaks to this speaks to the negative aspects of the adults, actually, that they don't themselves try to save everyone around them constantly. Like at least when it comes to the door-to-door people, they're like, they think they're doing the greater good, where like there's tons of religious people everywhere that firmly believe in these grand punishments and stuff, but also make no attempt to convert people, which on some level, despite it being annoying and a point of conflict and everything, like the people around you, if they do genuinely believe in this stuff, there's something like nice about them trying to convince you if it's something that they do think has these kinds of consequences, because otherwise it's a kind of callous of them to just like ignore you and just let you like die or not die, but you know, suffer the consequences of living the wrong life. I don't know, it's a whole thing. I'm just thinking about the ideas and so on. One thing I know is that even almost any form of almost anything I can say about religion can be offensive, in part because of the way I talk about it, because none of it has weight to me. So even if I'm not aggressively attacking it in any big way, just questioning it is kind of a bad thing on its own, or analyzing it the way you would analyze like the plot of a movie or like any other form of writing or argument somebody poses at you. Because when it's something that doesn't carry any weight in your life and doesn't mean anything to you, and it's just yet another idea in a giant sea of ideas, then you would argue that you would talk about religion the same way you would talk about like discussing like trans rights or discussing really anything else. Is just like, it's just yet another idea to explore and figure out the ins and outs of and what it means and so on. And that is inherently disrespectful in many ways to at least certain people that deal with said things. And so in some way, the idea of like a question about this is actually kind of pretty iffy, especially the idea of like picking a religion. It's like religious like tourism. Like, I'm just gonna adopt this entire culture and way of life, this thing that's so deeply ingrained into certain people that it shapes everything about how they see the world on a fundamental level. Like the idea of just being like, haha, that one is like terrifyingly weighty on some level, and I respect that and how much of a mess that can be. I don't know. And anything I say will be wildly uninformed, because I am not a religious scholar, and I am openly aware of that. Like, I know that the whole thing I said earlier probably doesn't make sense on some levels or whatever, but it was just a real conversation I had with somebody that was presenting religion to me unprovoked, and that's vaguely how it turned out. That whole thing. There's so many overlapping quests here, and I don't actually see what to do with any of them right now. Oh, this guy dropped something. There we go. Oh, because he's like a special spawn. Okay. But as far as like, if I picked one, I did a little Googling, and which tells you the weight of which I'm answering this with, I guess. And really, I think the closest thing to an answer I can land on is like, maybe Shinto. For me, the appeal is that Shinto is largely about tradition and ritualization and respecting the environment and kind of adding a weight to everything. It's kind of a form of like thoughtfulness and so on, or at least that's the gist I get. Because specifically, not having a founder or a messiah or scripture is really appealing to me if I'm gonna have to deal with a religion in general. I don't want to have some ancient figure that is telling me that he has the secrets to all of time and space. Just believe me and my book. Buy my book. And then he commands you. I'm inherently distrustful of people that try to tell you how to lead your entire life in a way that also elevates them, because that kind of just makes them generally feel like some kind of con man or somebody that's manipulating you to their own personal gain, which is what it's what a lot of figures end up looking like. And as a result, like, because of the extent that they get deified literally, and elevated. I don't necessarily even trust any historical accounts or of what they were supposedly like, because they're always framed as this like infinitely humble and powerful and wise figure that was basically perfect. And I'm like, that sounds like what somebody would write about themselves if they wanted history to remember them a specific way when they made their own religion, where they have all the power to dictate the history and memory of themselves forever. It's basically how, like, this might just piss somebody off. But just for perspective, it's basically how the leaders of North Korea talk about themselves, is also how the messiah and founder figures of many religions are remembered. And so you can see why me, as an outsider, would be inherently distrustful of these ideas, because whenever anyone makes these kinds of claims, it's often a case of maybe protesting too much and going way too far to elevate themselves in a crazy way. I don't know. It's a whole thing. Generally speaking, I have that really boring opinion of religion that you've probably heard plenty before, which is that you're allowed to think whatever you want to think, I guess, as long as it doesn't affect me and the people around me and so on, which is functionally not actually a system that works. It's not the best idea, because of the fact that, like, one thing is that when it shapes people's entire worldviews, it often does affect policy and stuff like that. And no amount of putting separation of church and state in the Constitution of the United States or anything is going to actually cause the separation of church and state, which has been functionally not a thing, despite the fact that it's supposed to be a basic thing that we all assume is in our government. Like, so many decisions about how LGBT people and so on are treated is founded entirely based on religious ideals and not any things that make sense argument-wise outside of those realms. And the only reason why said policy manages to stay in existence and maintain its hold over society is because such a significant percentage of the United States population is religious and agrees with said ideas for religious reasons. And as a result, there's a whole thing where, like, they'll pose really stupid arguments about why it's LGBT people don't deserve rights in this way or that way, and those reasons will always be stupid. And people will always argue about why those ideas are stupid, and it's very easy to poke holes in them because they're so flimsy, but it doesn't matter that you can disprove those ideas that are stupid, because that's not actually what they feel. The people you're arguing with don't actually propose those ideas because those are why they believe it. They're just putting up flimsy arguments that they're allowed to say because they themselves know about this supposed separation of church and state, so they know they have to frame their arguments in a non-religious context when the reasons behind their arguments are entirely religious in origin. So even if you disprove their arguments they're saying, it doesn't matter that you did that, because that's not the foundation of why they think that in the first place. It's just the shitty thing they put out in order to actually convince people, or to try to, like, propose some kind of argument when they need to. But the real reason is that their religion dictates that LGBT equals bad, and that's just the real stance on it. And all of them agree on that as a group. The people that oppose these things, they look at each other and all know that that's the real reason, but they also know that the argument they're supposed to pose publicly in any attempt to sway people has to be anything that's not based entirely in religion, because then it's just too naked that they're basing their policy on religion in a government that's supposed to not have religion in its policy. That's the whole thing. And once again, these are things I have access to grind, in part because not only do I have family that deals with homeopathy, I also have family that is LGBT, So, yeah. Some people will be like, you're not supposed to be all religious, or you're not supposed to be all political in your YouTubing thing, which I've said before in a previous video, that like I don't think that's necessarily true, and maybe is kind of irresponsible to be completely apolitical in your supposed platform. And in fact, many people like Boogie and so on that pretend to be apolitical end up just being a particular kind of nasty political that still is completely political, despite claiming to be non-political, because they're basically lying when they say that. And no, centrism is not a form of not being political. In fact, centrism has its own bag of worms and its own ideologies and blah. But generally speaking, when especially in a Q&A about my life and everything, politics and religion and LGBT and a bunch of concepts that are in real life will come up in the Q&A, even if some people get mad about that stuff, because that's the world. And it's, at some point, saying to not be political brings up a certain level of like saying not to talk about most of reality, because a lot of it intersects before long. I was supposed to use a net on the lashers. I don't think I've seen a lasher though, even once. Like at all. Where are they hiding? Where are they hiding? Sathe asks, we're doing 2 Sathe questions because I'm out of questions. Out of all the altered realities in movies, TV, books, and others, which one do you want to live in over our current reality? This is one of those things where there's so many possibilities to consider that it's a little hard to answer, just because of the fact that I'm basically just have to go with whatever I happen to remember at the time, because there's so many other examples, because I consume so much media, that's hard to remember the sheer number of, like, you know, just the sheer number of things that exist out there. But one thing, and it's also a common enough question that I've probably done on multiple other podcasts. Whoa, giant dinosaur. The Tyrant Devilsaur. Dude, you've been around since like 2000. Oh, he just teleported. He's been around since like 2006. It's an old ass character. Do I have to physically catch it with my, like, up close? What is this? I don't know how this works. Or do I just use this? Woo! I don't think I understand this quest. Maybe I have to hit them. But a core problem with this idea is often that even if a society seems good, almost every universe, especially alternate universes like sci-fi and fantasy, are almost constantly being threatened by like a world-shattering event, because that's the only it's like the stories we can only tell. So like Star Wars has the Empire slaving everything and blowing up worlds, and Star Trek has the Borg and many other unexplainable phenomenon that constantly lead to death in every episode. And Doctor Who seems like it has all these neat ideas, but also like is a show where somebody dies every episode basically, and like there's a lot of downsides to trying to answer this question basically. And also many universes are just straight up bad from front to back, like with no pretense of being good, because how bad the world is the basis of the conflict that makes the story happen, and so on. That's a whole thing. Yay. I don't think I know this quest. Maybe I'll check it in later and try to figure it out later, whatever this quest is. But really, I think, despite the threats, I guess one of the only ones I can think, and yeah, like that if a story didn't have enough conflict, then a lot of these properties would not be things I would remember, because the story having cool conflicts is why we remember the stories in the first place. So even if I had some like perfect utopia world I've heard about in some story, it would probably be one that I wouldn't remember the story of for the sake of this question because of the fact that it was unmemorable in its content. But I grew up watching Star Trek, and that Star Trek is very appealing. There's some dangerous things, but there's a lot of worlds in Star Trek where you get to just live out your life on a colony somewhere and so on. It's really appealing, the idea that they live in a post-scarcity society, which is crazy to think about. And they have replicators that just create food, and people don't have money because money doesn't serve a purpose in a post-scarcity society. So they just live and they pursue what they want to pursue. This person's an artist, this person's a sculptor, this person's a farmer because that's what they want to do. Didn't Picard have like a flash forward episode where it revealed him as like a farmer or something? It's been a while since I've watched Next Generation. A lot of people just kind of pursue their particular... That's not common. Leveling up by exploring. Damn. Just driving and the level up experience putting you over the edge. But a lot of people do in Star Trek just do what they want to do. Like all those people in Starfleet getting in those ships and exploring the universe are doing it of their own volition. And on some level that almost makes the deaths better on some level, even though they're still dying, but I mean like they weren't like some poor dude that's like has no more options and had to enlist in the military because his life was falling apart, and that seemed like the only way that he could fix his problems, and down on his luck, all these other narratives you hear sometimes. They're people that wanted to explore and experience the unknown and knew how scary and risky that could be. And so to some extent, some of these people, there's a certain amount of not only they knew the risks, but also they chose the risks that makes some of the deaths in Star Trek at least less dark than, you know, some poor enlisted man a week away from retirement just trying to make enough money for his mother's medical payments and stuff like that. Like the way darker aspect of how people who die, all the mooks and grunts and randos that die in action movies, be they cops or gangsters or bodyguards or whatnot, like so many of them, the backstory of how they got there is probably not great news for anyone, and probably a real bummer that all led to them dying there. Whereas at least in Star Trek, even the people that die are on like a well, at least the people that die on the Enterprise are at least people that are like on a self-driven mission of discovery and stuff like that. I don't know. I find something kind of hopeful and likable about that idea. At least. I went to the wrong place. So probably Star Trek. It'd be nice to just live in basically the socialist utopia concept, where technology has driven away scarcity and now people just are self-driven and self-made and do what they want, desire in life, specifically because many of the core conflicts and factors that demand us to do specific things in our modern life don't exist anymore as they've evolved as a society. I cannot remember how to get to this place. There's like a town around here, I think, unless they took it out. But yeah, that's probably it for today's questions. Sure, the comments will be great. No, that's it's largely been fine. When I talk about people getting mad in previous ones, it's usually only like a couple of people anyway. Although they do like pull their Patreon support and leave me mean messages and so on, which is fun. Even though I'm often answering the questions as presented and so on. This place has changed and I don't know where I'm going. There used to be like a little settlement that had like a Legend of Zelda character reference and quest zone and whatnot, but I think it's all been switched out because the whole map was changed at some point, and that's just a whole thing. But yeah, thanks for watching like always, guys. please ask me more questions, because we're running out again. And by running out, I mean we're out again. And if no other questions are in, I guess I'll go back to the grab bag of old questions from the before days and see if any of those can be relevant nowadays and so on. But yeah, see you guys next time.